Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We're super excited to talk about 5 areas where leaders need improvement as told by their direct reports. Doing the talking today, we have Jocelyn and Brennan. I'm going to hand it over to them to introduce themselves.
Hey everyone, Brennan and McEachran here from Hypercontext, CEO, co-founder. Do a little bit of everything, but most excited to hang out and talk shop with our customers and the market. So really excited to be here today and share data that the team has exhaustively captured and some real new learnings on what's happening in the market today. So really excited to share that and share those tips. Yeah, like I said, we try to keep this as interactive as possible. So ask questions, share thoughts, share ideas. We'll be looking at the chat the whole time. But with that out of the way, I'll pass it off to Jocelyn for introduction.
Yep, and I'm Jocelyn Brown, and I lead the customer success and sales efforts. So all I do is talk to customers and the market. So this reflects a lot of what I hear from leaders who are struggling or wanting to create a better experience for their teams. This is what I hear from friends and peers and others. So excited to share this with you guys with some really actionable advice that's based on the data we got from 500 plus employees at high growth tech companies. So really solid, well supported, try this today kind of advice.
Awesome. And I'm Nicole. I work on the marketing team at Hypercontext, and I will be hosting today. Just before we get into things, a little preview of what we're going to be discussing. First off, we're going to talk about the importance of managers. So why do we even care about making these improvements to the challenges that we're facing as managers? Then we're going to dive into the 5 top areas where managers need improvement as told by their direct reports, and also touch on actionable ways that we can address them and make those improvements. And lastly, we'll have a chance at the end for some Q&A. So throughout the discussion, if you have a question, just feel free to pop it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try our best to address it at the end of the session today. Before we get started, what gives us any authority to talk about this? We are Hypercontext, an app built with managers in mind at the forefront. And our goal really is to make managers' lives easier by providing a tool for one-on-ones, meetings, team meetings, cross-functional meetings, and goal setting. Over 100,000 managers have trusted us to help them lead their teams. And so we're really excited to talk to you today about this. And more specifically, we recently released a report on the state of high-performing teams in tech. And the report is based on data from 530 people working in tech specifically on how to build and retain high-performing teams. So what we'll be talking about today is mostly based off of data that we found from this report. So without further ado, I'll pass it off to Brennan to talk about the importance of managers.
Awesome. I will assume most of us in here are managers, but you never know. If you're a manager, say so in the chat. Tell me what type of team you manage, and I'll try to customize some of the tips as we as we go. You're probably aware of this. Managers are incredibly important, especially for high-performing teams. Similar to any high-performing sport, if you don't have a good coach, you're not necessarily going to have great results. What we find in the workplace is managers account for 70% of the variance in employee engagement scores. And often what we also find is that managers themselves are not always properly equipped. For the most part, people just stumble into management versus go through rigorous training. For example, we found that over 38% of managers have never received any management training, and often managers go about 10 years into their career before they even get a single day of training. When we looked at the data, what we wanted to see was what were some of the factors that good managers looked into in order to drive motivation in their team, that teams looked at to get motivation out of themselves. And one of the things we found is that having a good manager was the top three or one of the top three factors leading to motivation on your team. So if your team thinks you're a great manager, they're more likely to be significantly more motivated. When we go deeper, everything kind of on this list is actually interconnected to being a good manager. Whether you have fulfilling and challenging work at your workplace, your manager is kind of directly in control of that. Your manager is advocating on your behalf for a competitive salary. Your manager is the one setting and explaining the expectations and goals. So really everything that ladders up on this list towards motivation for your team basically boils down to having good management, being a good manager, and you're kind of at the heart of that. Those that are posting in the chat, you're kind of at the heart of all of that. As we go off to the next slide, on average, the surprising thing is while managers typically view themselves as doing an okay job, and most direct reports view them as doing a good job, those that aren't motivated really don't rate their managers that well. On average, we found that employees that were not motivated at work rated their manager a 5 out of 10. And for the most part, that's about as low as you can go on an out of 10 rating scale, right? Pretty rare for anyone to put 1, 2, or 3. So an average of 5 is very low. I think this just underscores what we already know. Managers play a huge role in motivating and engaging their employees, but the challenges they have are often overlooked. So what we want to do here with this webinar today is imagine a world where all of these ratings were 10 out of 10. What would we need to do right? What would we need to drive towards? It's not going to happen overnight, but there's a few things that we can do that can quickly increase your score. And that's what we're about to share with you today. So these are the top 5 challenges with some try it at work tomorrow tips. And Jocelyn and I are going to be covering each of those. Before we jump into it, before we share what those top 5 challenges are, we wanted to ask you, what is your largest challenge as a manager? And then we'll reveal what others wrote as well. So take a moment there to answer that poll. And yes, yeah, not motivated was self-assessment. They described themselves as not motivated at work. Yeah. Okay, so for those who have voted, haven't voted, what you'll see here is of the 530 people who filled out our survey, typically within high growth tech companies, 490 of those people reported to somebody, no matter where they sat in the org chart. And those people told us the top areas that their managers needed the most improvement were the following. So we're going to go through each of these today with you to share not only what we learned from the data, what some of the correlating factors were, but also what you can do to improve these areas. So they were having a clear vision and strategy for your team, is what employees rated their managers needing improvement on. Communicating well is the number 2 challenge that they thought their bosses had. The 3rd challenge they thought their bosses had was supporting career development and discussing performance. 4th, empowering the team and not micromanaging. And finally, 5th, being a good coach. So I think I'm passing this off to Jocelyn to tackle challenge number 1.
Yep. So as we saw there, that was the biggest gap for employees rating their managers, is that 24% of them identified setting a clear vision and strategy for the team as the area that their manager needed the most improvement. So why does it matter? I mean, the first reason it matters is that having a motivated or having a clear vision and strategy helps your company grow. Strategy and vision is what's driving growth in companies. And yeah, sorry, these are backwards. Sorry, Nicole, that's my fault. That relationship between people knowing their goals and actually being able to drive growth of the company is hugely apparent. And in fact, probably the most striking is in a shrinking company, how few people know their goal. So when in the survey, what we learned was that 60% of people, if you want to go back, Nicole, that was my fault. say agree that clear expectations and goals is the number one impacting their productivity. So if that's what's impacting their productivity and that's what's impacting growth, it's got to be a number one goal for managers to improve. But it also feels a bit daunting, right? Because strategy and vision are big words. They get thrown around a lot. It's really the what and the why. So your job is really to help your team understand what they need to be doing and why they are doing it. And you don't have to really do that alone. So in terms of just getting started and doing that, the first thing to do is to start, right? Set that goal setting cadence with your team quarterly. Use your company goals as that guiding factor, but take the input from the team. There's a couple benefits to that. One, you don't know everything. Your team can bring really rich information to the table about what needs to be done and what is actually going to drive alignment to those company goal and growth and otherwise. And then you also get that automatic buy-in, because if you've been in management long enough, you know that if you haven't said the goals so many times that you're sick of your own voice, you haven't said them enough. So by bringing them into that, participating in that setting of goals, you've got that immediate buy-in. They're now repeating that, and you've got that kind of collaborative process that they're doing it together, and they're bringing real input from the day-to-day work. So you're getting that sort of influence from the company goals, but you're also getting the bottom-up reality of what's going on in the field. And then, so first you start, and then you talk about them weekly. There is a massive difference in our research around people who talk about goals weekly and people who don't. So people talk about goals weekly are 2.7 times more likely to feel confident in hitting them. And frankly, confidence in your goal is half the battle. If you believe it, if you know what it is, if you're talking about it regularly, if you're checking in on it and making those course corrections on an ongoing basis, that's likely actually going to lead to you hitting them. So basically, the advice is to just get started, set a cadence for doing it, hold yourself accountable, involve your team, and then talk about it consistently and constantly.
So the second challenge that we found in our research was about communication. And we found that 15% of people thought their manager needed to improve how they communicate, which is funny, is a huge aspect of any manager's job is purely just communicating. While only 10% of the managers actually agree with that statement, we did find that 13 found collaboration as the top challenge that they faced. Communication, collaboration, they all go hand in hand. So we're going to talk a little bit about both here as we dive into the next section. Why does this matter, right? You've all communicate day to day. You've all obviously communicate with your manager. Why is this important for us to kind of cover here? One thing I think that's really good to know is that 40% of people agree that great communication is one of the top factors leading to productivity at work. So beyond just kind of the fun stuff with communication, it also gets down to the kind of hard nitty gritty of actually working, right? You need great communication to get things done, to achieve your goals, to actually grow as a business. Goals itself is a really great example of it. As Jocelyn said, you can have amazing goals. If they're not properly communicated, it doesn't necessarily matter, right? If they're not properly communicated, you're not going to increase your confidence in hitting them. And so while there might not be one tip maybe to rule them all as it relates to communication, one thing that I've always found frustrating with some of these vague things like become a better communicator is, what do you actually do about that? How do you actually fix these things? I think the first thing to know is that everyone on your team is different and everyone's communication style is very, very different. So instead of going in and saying, today I'm going to be a better communicator, I think the first thing you want to do is go in and say, how can I be a better communicator for each individual on my team? Knowing full well that they're going to have different answers to that question. There's not going to be a one size fits all solution to this particular problem. So the first thing is know that everyone's a little bit different. And then it's going to take some work to understand everyone's communication preferences on your team. One thing I would think about, just as like a try it at work tomorrow tip, is especially when you're talking to your team, you're setting up meetings, things like that. Take a look. I think we have an article for it, the maker versus manager schedule. If you're managing a team, I saw some of you were founders in there. If you're managing a team of people who are doing creative work, whether that's coding or designing, they're job requires them to be focused during the day. Talk to them about when during the day are they going to naturally have a break. Try to put some of your meetings around those times. Otherwise, you're interrupting some of that creative work. So just an example of something that might be really, really helpful. Maker versus manager schedule is a tip there that a lot of you might enjoy. Secondly, think about actively listening. Communication is not just the words that you're sharing to them. It's also the words they're sharing to you. And how do you get higher fidelity and higher bandwidth out of your team members? If you don't listen, they're going to stop sharing with you. If you don't encourage them to share, they're going to stop doing it. And also, if you're not actively listening, you can't make change based on the feedback, the words that they're giving you. And if you're not making change from it, then they're going to definitely stop sharing. One of the things that we've probably written an article about it as well, I've talked about, especially in one-on-one meetings, is this concept of having a high safety environment, a high benefit environment, and a low effort environment. What's really valuable at that, and maybe I'll just go to the low effort, or sorry, the high benefit, is when people share feedback to you, when people communicate things to you, there's an expectation that you as a manager will do something with that information. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go and bow to everything that they request, but they do expect that you're going to do something, even if it's communicating to them, hey, I'm going to listen to this, I'm going to do more research, I'm going to come back to you and say, I'm not going to do anything. If you don't even have that conversation, often what happens, you've probably heard people say this at other workplaces, is you'll hear employees say things like, what's the point? They don't even listen anyways, right? And they'll have that generic complaint about management. So really important for you to think about, how can you turn active listening from something that's vague into something that's very, very specific and actionable for you. And the last thing I'll say here, especially when it comes to more of a group setting, is how do you make these meetings more inclusive for all voices? Again, really hard for everyone to listen, really hard for everyone to kind of manage each other's communication preferences, but some people find it excruciatingly hard to actually share their opinion and voice in the workplace, especially in a team setting. So during those one-on-one meetings that you do have, make sure you're diving into some of those deeper thoughts. But particularly if you have members of your team that feel like they're the minority in the room, you're going to want to make sure that you're going out of your way to include them. One of the things we found in our study was that Gen Z in the room feels the least comfortable speaking up during meetings. So I think it's your job as you're facilitating the meetings to make sure you're going to those people and saying, hey, do you have any thoughts here? Do you have any ideas? Do you have anything to add to this conversation, to invite that out of them? Otherwise, they're going to hold it in. Similarly, we found that regardless of tenure and experience, women of color were the least likely of all groups to feel comfortable speaking during internal meetings at work. And again, this probably relates more to the diversity of the room than it does necessarily to the ethnicity of the person. But if you do find yourself with a room that's not very diverse, with few exceptions, make sure you're going to those people and inviting their feedback, inviting for them to share during any meeting at work, because obviously all these voices are really valuable. So a couple tips in there, a couple things to think about, a little bit of data points for you as well about communication. I'll pass it off to Jocelyn for challenge number 3.
Yeah, and just before we get on to challenge number 3, there's tons of research, you trip over it if you looked, saying that the diversity of opinion drives outcomes, right? So more diverse opinions, the better your outcomes are going to be. So spending the time and effort has got a real business benefit to it. It's not just about making people feel comfortable. It's actually going to improve the outcomes and the solutions that you're coming up with. So well worth the while.
Yeah, Google did a study internally on their own teams, and they found the number one factor for individual and team performance, as measured by hitting goals, was psychological safety. Effectively, do people feel comfortable sharing in these settings? If you have high psychological safety at Google, you're more likely to be a high performing team.
Yep.
That was the number one factor beyond anything else.
Yep. The next challenge was about supporting career development and performance. So if you've read our study, one of the things that sort of jumped out at me in the first time we looked at it was that compensation only matters to a point when it comes to retaining people. And that once you get to sort of fair pay, it's about the career development and performance, and the managers have a massive role to play there. 14% of people agreed that their managers need to improve in this area, and their managers agreed, right? So this is, both people think that this is an important area of development for them. And why it matters is, as I stated at the front, it's retention. Again, you will trip over stats that will tell you how expensive it is to replace the people that you lose. And if 17% of the respondents are saying they've applied for a new role because there weren't enough growth opportunities, then that's something worth spending time to improve. Now, you may not be able to control when an advancement opportunity is available, but you can prepare for it, and you can help the people on your team actually build towards the things they want in a career. And probably more important than that, help them identify what they want in a career. It's not always obvious until you get into the work what it is that you really want to do, or what it is. So in terms of spending some time and actually digging in on this career development, a couple tips to go for this. Oh, first of all, are you doing it? Hopefully all of you are. You're here, so my gut is that you guys are making some effort, because you're actually investing the time to learn about this. But essentially, the first tip is exactly that, is to set professional development goals with your direct reports. We talked about it in terms of clear alignment and goals being a major contributor to motivation at the team level, manager setting them with the team. The same really applies when it gets to the individual level. So the time that you spend as a manager, because you're actually the only one doing it, on setting goals is critical. So those of you who are saying sometimes, now's the time to make it a consistent habit that you have. And in the same way that you don't have to have all the answers when you're setting a team vision, and otherwise participate, spend the time with your direct report. You can't assume you know what it is that they want to do. So it's really about setting those goals together, trying to identify what is it that they actually want. And sometimes they don't know. And some of that goal setting may be to actually go and figure it out. So this is really setting you up, one, to know what they're interested in, so that in the rooms that they're not in, you can put them forward to the opportunities that are going to help them build their career and help them advance, but also get them ready. So if there's a gap between what they have in terms of skills today and what they want to be, you can actively be working on closing that gap while they're in their role they are today. You can actively be exposing them to the people and to the types of work that they might be doing. They may find out they hate it. They may find out that's not what they want at all. But you need to be actively working on it so that they feel like there's progression. Progression doesn't always mean that you're advancing in your seniority or in a title. Progression can actually be you're just getting better at what you do, or you're getting a broader set of skills that is going to set you up for all the things you want to do in the forward. So setting those goals together, putting some actionable things in there, and have them participate with you. We have a huge library of goals that they can start with, right? So start with some examples from other people and edit from there. Remove all the barriers and the friction, make it easy for you. It doesn't have to be all up to you. This is their career as well. You're there to coach and help them through it. Feedback. I mean, I think, again, you can trip over the number of stats there are about the importance of feedback, and 52% of people we surveyed say they don't get enough feedback and they'd like it. They say the feedback they get is valuable, but there's just not enough of it. So feedback is a tough muscle or habit to build. So there's a couple of ways that you can do that. One is you can put it into your one-on-ones and have it a standing item. Feedback that they have for you and feedback that you give to them. You've got to build that psychological safety that Brennan talked about, and it takes time to do that. One of the ways you can do that, and one of the longest lasting ways to do that, is not just to ask for feedback from your employees, but to share with them a time that you got feedback and made an adjustment. that's actually going to build a longer lasting bridge to them around feedback than anything else you'll do. So the first thing you need to do is show them that feedback matters and that you actually use it. And then they'll start being able to listen to the feedback that you're giving. So make it a habit, put it there, share when you've gotten feedback and when it's, and how you changed after that. And then the last thing you'll see on feedback that you'll see from us is we often talk about the lettuce pack. So normalizing feedback, right? Set the boundary right up front, or the habit right up front, that you are there to help them. So if somebody's got lettuce stuck in their teeth and no one tells them, that's not really fair. So right at the outset, set that rule that anytime I have a tough piece of feedback for you, let's just establish that this is how it's going to happen. So let them know it's coming. Make it an expected behavior, make it a comfortable behavior, make it a safe place to be able to have those conversations. And one of the ways to make that safe is to have a space for it weekly. So having weekly one-on-ones has a similar kind of impact to growth, or correlation rather, to growing companies that have an understanding clear goals and expectations does. So, 72% of people at companies growing 3X have weekly one-on-ones, whereas only 40% at companies that are shrinking are having weekly one-on-ones. So don't be like them. Be with the rest of them up and having weekly one-on-ones. And then that's an easy way to make feedback a habit, because you're doing it every week at the least. And eventually that'll be a habit that extends beyond those weekend one-on-ones.
I think the other thing to think about here as well is especially for, I saw some of your hiring, right? And especially in the rapid growth scenarios, if you are hiring, the reward of being done hiring is always the most exciting thing. And you definitely don't want to lose a team member, at the very end there. And so thinking about, as you're hiring, thinking about some of these career growth development opportunities that also exist for your existing team members, right? Maybe there's someone who joined the team expecting the job would be something and it's something else. Maybe we can move that person into a different role. And the benefit there is if you are rapidly hiring, you might already have a pool of applicants that are interested in this person's job. So something to think about. And obviously the cost of losing someone is extreme compared to the cost of hiring. So look at that. One other thing I thought was interesting, I don't know why this popped into my head as you were talking, Jocelyn, was one of our customers, the CEO of a rapidly growing company, and in their first one-on-one, one of the ways that they start to create this culture of feedback in these conversations and one-on-ones is they expect during onboarding the person to give the CEO direct feedback on something that could be better about their onboarding, or something that the CEO needs to do better. And if it's not good enough, the CEO won't take it. They're like, go deeper, do something you think will hurt my feelings, right? Let's really get good feedback starting to flow here on, at the end of week one. And what he does that I thought was really interesting was whenever they get something that's like meaningful feedback that they feel like they couldn't share on the first week at work, he exaggerates how happy he is with it, right? Like he is elated and over the moon, and is overly rewarding of them sharing that feedback, and make sure that they get a big smile on their face for sharing that feedback. And I think some of these little things that you can do, and especially in these moments that you have together one-on-one, can have lasting impacts on the culture of your team for quite a while. Okay, on to challenge number 4. What's funny is what did Jocelyn say? Over 50% of people feel like they need more feedback, yet no one wants to be micromanaged, right? So challenge number 4 is, how do you empower your team without micromanaging them? We all know micromanaging is bad. No one wants to be the micromanager. You're pretty rare that you bump into someone in real life that says like, oh, I'm the best micromanager in the world. However, according to employees, it's very common, right? And a lot of managers don't even know that they're doing it. 10% of the direct reports that we found, that we surveyed, think that their managers micromanage all of the time. 20% of the managers that we surveyed felt like it was their largest challenge. How do I not micromanage? What's interesting here is there's this micromanaging, which people want to avoid. And then there's feedback that people want and need on their work and on their career and on their growth. People desperately want. What's the difference between these two? A lot of this is about zooming into the right level of content that's productive. Micromanaging stifles growth. It creates kind of a toxic environment. It makes the team feel like you don't trust them, that you won't get anything done. It makes them scared to think outside of the box. It makes them scared to take ownership over the work. So a few things you can do to nudge yourself from the spectrum of micromanaging to feedback. Typically, I think the first is to know that for the most part, micromanaging stems usually from a lack of trust and fear. And often that can be generated during onboarding. So I would think about, especially those who are hiring the teams, what are ways that you can properly teach people things? The stuff that you have in your head, the questions that you're asking about their work, how can you teach them to have those same questions about their work versus always just feeding them the answers? But two of the largest things that you can do is create accountability and build trust. So on the accountability front, I think what you want to make sure that you're doing is being very clear what they're responsible for, what they're owning, what they get to do independently versus where they might need to consult someone, where they might need to bring things for feedback. I think the goal here really is to get them to lead the charge on the accountability pieces, bring things to you when they need feedback versus jumping in at random points in the day and giving them feedback. We have a topic we like to refer to a lot here as it relates to getting feedback on projects called the 10-50-99 framework. I think we call it a framework, which is really helpful in project type work, where you get your team to bring you stuff, work, projects, designs, whatever it happens to be when it's 10% done. And what's the type of feedback that you can give in that moment that's not micromanaging? Whereas when something's 99% done, you probably don't want to tell them to tear it up and start over from scratch, right? Because they did one thing wrong. So I think about some of those things like 10-50-99 framework on our site somewhere. The other thing I think about if you're really struggling with people stepping on each other's toes is just defining what are the roles for a particular project. Something like a RACI framework can be pretty helpful in just defining who's responsible for this work, who's accountable for getting this work done, who needs to be consulted, and who needs to be informed. Sometimes defining those roles is really, really helpful and giving people the freedom to operate within a box without feeling like you're jumping in and course correcting at every moment. Second thing is build trust. So we'll launch a poll here. For those that are doing one-on-ones, how useful do you find your one-on-ones? And then we'll reveal the answer from the other 590. But while you guys complete that, building trust is not easy. And we find one-on-ones to be a really helpful place and moment for managers to build a ton of trust. One thing I'll say about one-on-ones is it's not just that's a moment in which you can kind of put on a mask and start doing trust building exercises. I think it's everything that leads into creating a culture of trust between two people. And so the first thing I would say is, can the employee trust that that meeting is going to happen? Can the employees trust that that meeting is going to happen at that time, at the same day? And if so, you can actually start to reap a lot of benefits from trusting that there is a moment for feedback, trusting that there is a moment to share an idea, trusting that there is a moment to bring something up that might be a little bit more complicated. If you know, oh, on Tuesday, I have a one-on-one, I'll bring it up with them. Otherwise, I'll get back to work. Or if you see something wrong as a manager, you can bring it up in one-on-one. You first have to trust that those meetings happen, that you're not going to cancel them, that they're not going to disappear or be delayed. I talked to one employee at a company who hadn't had a one-on-one with their manager in a year. And this was at the start of the pandemic. So he's like, I started working from home. I actually haven't talked to my boss since. Don't be like that person. And what you'll see here, not too different than the ratings that we have in the poll, is that one-on-ones are actually rated as the most useful meeting compared to every other meeting that exists on those respondents calendars. Nicole, if you want to show that, more useful than the quarterly planning meetings, which is surprising to me, more useful than some of those stand-ups, more useful than some of the retrospective meetings, is those one-on-one meetings that you're having. And we found this to be true no matter of seniority, no matter of team, no matter of how busy you are. In fact, often the more busy you are, the more valuable these one-on-ones became. So if you're in that group that feels like you're neutral or you're somewhat, I think that the one thing to think about is, why does everyone else get a ton of value out of it? What am I doing that is maybe low value when I could be doing some maybe more high leverage activities in these one-on-ones to get as much value as some of my peers. So with that out of the way, off to Jocelyn for the fifth and final.
Yep. That confidence the one-on-one is going to happen has always been sort of the saving grace for me, because then I don't interrupt everybody. I'm an interrupt-driven person, so it's terrible if people are always interrupting me, because I will accept the interruption every single time. But I definitely don't want to inflict that on others, and especially Brennan talked about the maker manager schedule. If you go and look at the visual that accompanies that article, it's remarkable. It's been a long time since my calendar looked like a maker calendar, and I would forget. So just knowing what time is going to not interrupt their flow is going to help their productivity, is going to help their relationship with you, because you're respecting their boundaries, their flow, and hopefully you're coming to an agreement on what's going to be the best time. So last piece is being a good coach. I don't know about everybody else, but I feel like I spent most of February watching some sport or another, becoming an expert in curling and luge and all sorts of things that I watch every 4 years. And I've also spent a ton of time in hockey arenas here in Calgary watching my nephews play. And I think when you really are trying to achieve something great, you often turn to a coach. I mean, I can't remember whose ad it was, but somebody had a whole ad campaign around coaches. And that's really a huge part of an athlete's success. And if you talk to lots of executives, if you talk to lots of people that are trying to do something different or trying to achieve something great, a lot of people are turning to coaches. It's natural that in the work environment, people are going to want to turn to their manager as a coach. And 9% of the people we surveyed think that the manager could improve in their coaching skills. But why does that matter? I mean, how can you actually tie that together? Well, 56% are saying that fulfilling and challenging work is a top factor for impacting motivation. Challenging work probably requires somebody to stretch, probably requires somebody to learn something, probably requires some coaching. And certainly when we look at what the sort of top performers in any field are doing, some of that's actually being helped by a coach. And so that's really why spending some time thinking about how you can help coach is important. Now, one problem that people might see is that you are sometimes not an expert in the function that you're managing. And certainly as you go up in your career, you probably have less practical knowledge about what's actually happening, and you can give less technical advice. But that actually is not the main purpose of coaching. And in fact, the main thing that you can do to improve your coaching is to listen. First of all, you can't make assumptions on what people need to coach. Just because you observe something doesn't mean that that's the thing that they're trying to improve on, or that's the stretch that they need to make. So just even starting to understand what it is that they're trying to improve on. But when it comes to something where you're maybe not an expert on the sort of technical execution of something, the questions that you ask that help somebody work through their own thoughts about something, that help people tie it to the context of what you're trying to accomplish as a team, as what you're trying to accomplish as a business, is going to help reveal a whole bunch of things like that. And having the space in those weekly one-on-ones to do that kind of work and do that kind of coaching is in fact going to be a massive accelerator for people. So you don't have to know the answer. You have to care that that somebody else is trying to look for it. You have to provide some context from which they can look at the problems that they're looking at it. The second piece of that is really around learning and development opportunities. And we talked about that in terms of sort of career development and career pathing. Same goes for coaching. And it doesn't have to always come from you. Some of the piece of this is that you are looking out for things that they're trying to understand, learn, stretch, and achieve in. And maybe you're actually connecting them. You may not, in fact, be the person coaching on them, but you're making sure that they get the coaching. So I think sometimes it feels like everything falls on the manager to do all of these different roles that are complicated and require all these skills. And I would say that you aren't responsible for executing every single one of them. You're responsible for making sure that they happen, however that may end up being. And that could be training courses externally, that could be other people in the company. But first and foremost, just start listening to it. And then I would say learning and development is really a team sport. It's not all going to come from you. It doesn't have to, probably shouldn't. Diversity of thoughts will improve the outcome. So it's about listening for those things that they need, making a path towards it.
Okay, so we talked about a lot of things, and this is often the point in time people can say, oh, I got everything I wanted out of the webinar. Though I will say that there's some really helpful stuff coming in the next couple minutes. A couple things. I mean, we've obviously talked about 5 of the most sought after changes in every manager's style. We've given at least 2 or 3 try it at work tomorrow tips for each of those. If you blinked, you'd probably miss some of that. And there's a lot that's really complicated and hard. And there's a lot that's really vague. Overall, like if nothing else, you're probably being asked to do a lot more coming out of this webinar than maybe you would have been doing prior. I think there's 2 things to think about as key takeaways. The first is setting, communicating goals and expectations is incredibly important, but beyond the fact that you have them, beyond the fact that they're set, I think a lot of people look at the first 2 words, they're set and communicate, and leave it at that. It's that the frequency of the communication matters a lot. Most people will forget very quickly. I believe the stat is something like you only recall 28% of what was said in a meeting after 1 or 2 days. So it's not just about setting, it's not just about communicating, it's about setting and communicating every single week until it's no longer relevant, and then communicating it's no longer relevant and why it's no longer relevant, and then setting and communicating the next set of goals. And so that would be the first takeaway. The second one is one-on-ones are essential touch points that are kind of catch-alls for all of these topics. They're an opportunity, a moment for you to flex some of these managerial concepts and ideas and skills where you can give feedback, you can receive feedback, you can set expectations, you can communicate goals, you can come up with the next set of goals. And doing those on a frequent basis in a dependable way creates a lot of the good aspects of a culture on your team that kind of resonate with employees in a lot of different ways. So I would think about those 2 things, and I would think about putting them together in a way that kind of checks all the boxes. Now, that's maybe hard to do. You'll have to watch this video and watch the slides and take some notes, maybe if you didn't, in order to put that all together into one easy to follow meeting. What we did prior, once we saw the data, is just come up with a template for you. So for those who didn't take notes, we took all the notes for you. We put together an ultimate one-on-one meeting template that literally is inspired by the data, inspired by the science in a lot of these cases. It's got the stuff you need to talk about weekly set up in a weekly format. It's got a whole bunch of icebreakers in there if you don't necessarily have that rapport with your team just yet. It's got things you should talk about periodically, quarterly, monthly, and conversations you just need to have once. All the links are handily in there. Hiba's put a link to that template itself. So if you want to get started with a template instead of rolling your own framework for all of these concepts, you can go ahead and start with that one. The guide, the walkthrough that's there, links out to all of the science and stuff that we've been talking about. And then on top of that, we will be sharing the recording of all of this stuff too. So if you want some of the nuance that we shared, you'll be getting that really soon. So go there, PDF, Word, Excel, although all of those are lame compared to our tool. As mentioned at the start, at Hypercontext, we help managers and employees run these types of meetings in the exact same way the best managers in the world run them. So if you want kind of an easy one click, let's follow this template, let's get all these best practices built in, click the bigger of the buttons, and sign up for our app as well.
Tiffany asked, my manager encourages one-on-ones only quarterly. How do I get her to agree they're necessary more often? That's a good question.
Getting questions. I was stressing there for a second. How are we going to get rid of the swag? I'm just kidding. Yeah, it's a great question, Tiffany. So what do you do if you want to increase the frequency with your manager? I think there's kind of two things that go hand in hand here. One is, how busy your manager is, and how much value you're getting out of that meeting. It seems like from the question that you're getting value out of those meetings, you want to do them more frequently. And I would say that the first thing is to just share that. That might maybe feel like you're coming from a place of vulnerability, but to say, hey, whether this is your next one or whether this is just on the next one-off meeting you have, is, hey, I find these meetings really, really valuable and really helpful for me to do my job and accomplish the goals that I have on any given week. I would love to increase the frequency of them, right? Doesn't necessarily have to go from quarterly to weekly. That might be a big ask, but it might go from quarterly to every other week, right? The second thing I would do is make sure one-on-ones in particular, I think, can be your meeting and not necessarily their meeting. So on that next one-on-one, put forth the effort to make it the most valuable meeting that person is having that day, right? So not just how do you make it valuable for yourself, but how do you also make it valuable for that person and make them crave that kind of value every single time. A lot of that comes with some of the things that you're going to hear are like standard best practices for every meeting, like showing up prepared, putting your notes, sharing your notes ahead of schedule, all of those things. But in there, I would just put a formal ask of doing it more frequently.
Yeah, and I think the agenda, so they know what to expect, and an insight, right? Because I think like our results actually show that the more meetings you have, the more valuable the one-on-ones are. And that's usually because you don't get access to as much of the kind of field level data and maybe what's happening on the ground level that actually can help feed and inform a strategy, and something that you can give to two things you can give to your manager. One is insight that they can't get any other way. That makes those meetings and that time valuable and can help them in their job of defining strategy and developing things. And also ways to keep you. We just talked about how expensive it is to recruit and retain, to recruit. And so retention is one part of it. Sharing with them what helps you stay in the company and stay motivated is another piece of information they can't get anywhere else. So it's unique information that's going to help them with their job as well as help keep you in the company.
Awesome. And Owen asked, how much vulnerability is too much?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's going to depend on the person, probably that you're talking to. I would say that the first thing is, especially as you think about your direct reports, they are almost always more vulnerable in sharing information to you than you will ever be in sharing information to them, right? There's an inherent power dynamic there, right? In that you can fire them usually, they can't really fire you. So when they're sharing information about their work, they're vulnerable, right? When you're sharing information about their work, you're not vulnerable. So I think there's almost by default a pretty heavy imbalance of vulnerability that favors the manager. And I think what you want to do is just lower your bar as much as you can reasonably to make them feel safer raising their bar. And I think you just want to raise their bar to the whatever height is necessary for you to get feedback that you can action on yourself, feedback that you can action on team and process at the company, and Anything beyond that might be erring maybe too close to the side of friend or too close to the side of best friend or something like that. And that's obviously going to depend on the person and their personality and their style. But if they don't feel comfortable, sharing that they didn't think they did a good job on a particular task or project or call, then you're not going to be able to coach that. So what you want to do, I think, is just lower and be a little bit vulnerable first. Show them that it's okay. If you don't feel okay being vulnerable, there's no way that they're going to feel okay being vulnerable. So similar to what Jocelyn said, share an example where, and be vulnerable, lead with that first. Share an example where you did something maybe not so great. You got that feedback. It really helped you. You'd like to kind of pay that forward. Things like that go a long way in being helpful.
Awesome. Chris asked, note-taking after one-on-ones is a pitfall. He tries to avoid doing it because it's a distraction. What suggestions do you have to simplify documenting one-on-ones outside of just putting the onus on the employee to do it?
Yeah, I like use our app. That would be so definitely use Hypercontext. I actually think the real tip is in a way is how the app was designed. So if you're going into a meeting and discovering a whole bunch of things, then the notes are really valuable because you're like, oh crap, I didn't know that. I got to write it down. And this is almost harder than taking notes, but having an agenda in advance means you're spending the time not discovering topics, but coming up with solutions and context and details behind it. So the first thing I would say is try to show up with an agenda, and that can serve as the basis for your notes. So instead of trying to recall everything at the end of the meeting, what did we talk about? Why, right? You have those agenda points as prompts for notes later. And I would say that particularly in the case of one-on-ones, like the note-taking can be shared between both parties.
Yeah. And I would add to that it's more about the summary of the discussion than it is about the detailed notes of it. So if your agenda is there as the checklist to remind you that we talked about this set of things and it's done ahead of time, you don't have to actually do it when you're in the meeting, then what you're really pausing to take notes on is anything that got decided or anything that needs to get done. So you've got half your notes done before the meeting starts, and you're using that summary or that next step as a way to make sure that you both heard the same thing and to agree on it, which is also helping with reinforcement. So make those notes short and simple and shared.
Awesome. And I think we have time for one more question. Someone anonymous asked, what is a good way to bring up concerns that your team shares with you to upper management when they specifically ask you not to share? And do you do that?
I mean, I think you definitely don't want to break their trust. So naming them and exactly what it is that you did. I think you're looking for the pattern rather than an individual piece of feedback. So I think if you're hearing something similar from lots of people, that becomes a generalized theme that you could bring to upper management, and you don't have to expose that individual person. If it's anything very serious, I think you've got to talk to them about needing to expose it. So certainly never break their confidence if that's what they've said. And if possible, generalize it into a pattern. But depends how serious it is. There are some things that if that's what's being brought to you, that's serious enough that it needs to be dealt with. But more often than not, people just don't want to be identified as the complainer or the tattletale or something like that. So start looking for it in a generalized sense, maybe validate it, not necessarily with upper management, with maybe peers or other places. And then you can start bringing it in as a more generalized concern.
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, maybe we have time for one more. We'll do one more.
Sure.
Jeff asked, how do you support individuals and teams in setting their goals if you aren't a subject matter expert or even experienced in their area of the business?
I think this is similar to what Jocelyn said. You don't have to be better than them in order to help coach them. And I think about this a lot. I'm a basketball fan, so I think in terms of basketball. And I saw someone's from California, so I'll pick on the two California teams. there's no way the coach of the Lakers is going to be better at basketball than LeBron James. There's just no way, right? There's no way that coach of Golden State is going to be better at shooting three, although he's pretty good when he was a player, at shooting 3-pointers than Steph Curry. It's just impossible. They're two of the greatest to play the game. Yet they're still coaches, and they're still great coaches, right? So how do they do that? And I think the first thing is you have to collaborate with those people. And when you're talking about coming up with goals, you're talking about coming up with aspects of the business they can help in, you don't always have to lead as the authority figure. I think you can lead as a peer and say, hey, you're the expert over here. I am here to help translate your expertise to what the business needs. And here's the 4 things the business needs. Can you go and come up with like 4, 5, 10 different ways that you can help the business achieve those goals with your skill set, right? And then let's work on that together. Let's workshop it together. Let's figure it out together. We have, and like a twist on kind of that tip, we have the largest library of goal examples on the internet on our site, available for free. So on the off chance that role exists on the goal library, you can take maybe 5 or 10 of those, or give that link to the person on your team and say, hey, here's the largest library of goal examples. Steal some that you think could be valuable, and let's edit together.
Yeah, I think the most powerful thing you can bring to them is context, and then confidence in their own goals, right? So the more that you ask them to explain or go deeper or sharpen some of those goals, the better it will become, not because you know anything about what it is that they are technically doing, but because you've asked them to clarify their thinking within the context of your business. You're there really to help them with context.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we're out of time for today. Thanks so much for everyone for joining and for asking great questions. We really appreciate it.